Welcome back to a look back on the past. In today's segment, we will be re-examining the integration of Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. In September of 1957, 9 black students tested the enforcement of Brown v. Board of Education by attending the previously all-white high school. Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 outlawed segregation in public schools, a policy that was previously upheld by Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. These students are remembered as the Little Rock Nine: Minnie Jean Brown, Terrence Roberts, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Thelma Mothershed, Melba Patillo, Gloria Ray, Jefferson Thomas, and Carlotta Walls. Elizabeth Eckford arrived alone on the first scheduled day of school for the Little Rock Nine, resulting in the famous image of a black girl surrounded by hostile white students. Governor of Arkansas Orville Faubus brought in the National Guard to prevent Eckford from attending classes. Several NAACP lawyers, including Thurgood Marshall, got a federal district court injunction to stop the governor's efforts. Martin Luther King, leader of the nonviolent civil rights movement, sent a telegram to President Eisenhower recommending he, quote, take a strong and forthright stand in the Little Rock situation. King warned that lack of government interference in Little Rock would, quote, set the process of integration back 50 years, and that it is a, quote, great opportunity for the federal government to back up the longings and aspirations of millions of people of goodwill and make law and order a reality. President Eisenhower realized government involvement in Arkansas was necessary to spare himself an international embarrassment. After harassment and mass rioting, police attempted to escort 9 students through a mob of 1,000 protesters, but were forced to remove the students for their own safety on September 23rd. The president addressed the country on September 24th on the crisis in Little Rock. A segment of his address highlights the responsibility of the executive branch to enforce the court's decision in 1954, regardless of personal opinions on the matter.
Whenever normal agencies prove inadequate to the task, and it becomes necessary for the executive branch of the federal government to use its powers and authority to uphold federal courts, the president's responsibility is inescapable. In accordance with that responsibility, I have today issued an executive order directing the use of troops under federal authority to aid in the execution of federal law at Little Rock, Arkansas. This became necessary when my proclamation of yesterday was not observed, and the obstruction of justice still continues. It is important that the reasons for my action be understood by all our citizens. As you know, the Supreme Court of the United States has decided that separate public educational facilities for the races are inherently unequal, and therefore compulsory school segregation laws are unconstitutional. Our personal opinions about the decision have no bearing on the matter of enforcement. The responsibility and authority of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution are very clear. Local federal courts were instructed by the Supreme Court to issue such orders and decrees as might be necessary to achieve admission to public schools without regard to race and with all deliberate speed.
The following day, 1,200 U.S. Army soldiers and over 10,000 National Guardsmen proceeded to escort the students successfully through their first day of school. The students remained under protection for the rest of the school year. King sent a follow-up telegram to the White House thanking President Eisenhower personally, reading, "I wish to express my sincere support for the stand you have taken to restore law and order in Little Rock, Arkansas. In the long run, justice finally must spring from a new moral climate. Yet, spiritual forces cannot emerge in a situation of mob violence. You should know that the overwhelming majority of Southerners, Negro and white, stand firmly behind your resolute action. The pen of history will record that even the small and confused minority that oppose integration with violence will live to see that your action has been a great benefit to our nation and to Christian traditions of fair play and brotherhood. Signed, Martin Luther King Jr., President of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. President Eisenhower thanked King on October 7, 1957. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SLCC, formally thanked the president in a second telegram in November.
How exactly did Arkansas resist the Brown versus Board of Education ruling? The desegregation of public schools in the segregated South was difficult. Prior to 1954, several states had segregation laws in place that prevented white and black students from going to the same school. Schools for black and white students were deemed separate but equal under Plessy versus Ferguson. Resistance to Brown versus Board of Education was rampant, leading the court to issue a second statement by the name of Brown versus Board of Education II, or Brown II, in 1955. Brown II demanded that all school districts integrate schools with all deliberate speed. These court rulings sparked the Civil Rights Movement, where African Americans fought hard for social justice.
Furthermore, in the Supreme Court case Sweatt v. Painter in 1950, the Supreme Court issued that separate law schools for blacks and whites were not equal, and with McLaren v. Oklahoma State Regents, also in 1950, the Supreme Court ruled that segregating graduate students violated their equal protection rights. For many state and local governments, segregation was becoming more expensive to maintain and harder to exercise across local schools. Yet, despite action by the Supreme Court, white officials and students across the country refused to acknowledge the principle of equality for all Americans. In the case of Arkansas, Governor Faubus, along with other whites, deemed that integrating schools would bring violence to the area, and therefore segregation should remain. It was not until Eisenhower issued Executive Order 10730 in 1957 that integration of schools were strictly enforced by the federal government.
In 2009, President Bill Clinton stated, "Seeing the Little Rock Nine face down the angry mob fascinated me and inspired an emotional bond that has lasted a lifetime," in a foreword to Carlotta Walls for her book A Mighty Long Way. At the time of the incident, Clinton would have only been 11 years old, watching the chaos from his home. Later, during his presidency, Clinton would award the Congressional Gold Medal to each of the 9 students known as the Little Rock Nine. The lasting effects of their triumph in Arkansas are thus shown all the way through the highest tier of our system of government, beginning by intriguing an 11-year-old boy who would someday become president.
Unfortunately, many textbooks only briefly mention the ordeal surrounding Central High School and the Little Rock Nine. In our own U.S. history textbook, James Fraser offers a mere half a page on the Little Nine ordeal, found on page 780, and he fails to fully capture the extreme magnitude of the integration Central High School went through. Why is this the case for so many textbooks when this is a crucial piece of our nation's history? Ultimately, the integration of schools in the South is oftentimes oversimplified, explaining why many textbooks trivialize the events of Central High School. With the Supreme Court decision in 1954 of Brown v. Board of Education, segregated schools were ruled inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. Many textbooks and people mention this, referencing this as a key event that ended school segregation. However, Brown v. Board of Education did not end segregation immediately and outright. In fact, as evident from Central High School, many southern states were adamant on maintaining segregated schools despite the federal government intervening. It's important to know, however, that school segregation persisted well beyond the Brown v. Board of Education ruling. Furthermore, segregation is something many people in the U.S. would like to forget. Many textbooks would rather portray the civil rights movement as a totally successful movement, when in fact school segregation persisted beyond the 50s and even into today.